Namaste and good evening, everyone. Namaste, Narad, who is with us.
Namaste, Alina. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste, Narad, and welcome to everybody.
We are happy to continue today, part 11, on the same theme, the current affairs, and we will be exploring this time the situation in Israel. As usually, you may post your questions during our conversation in the chat box, or you may send your questions at our email ID, integralstudies.in@gmail.com. We have some questions we'll take from Mahesh and Krishna. Mahesh, he was writing, you have hit it spot with your talk on the pushback. The war over the Holy Land is another one which is obviously being orchestrated by the very same dark forces again. This time they plan to take it to a different level before they themselves will bring it back in control. They are following the biblical prophetic timeline, which will end with the third temple being built on the Holy Land. There will be an unlikely savior who will surface. Let's see who it is. And Krishna, it is interesting to see how the war theater shifted from Ukraine to Israel almost a month after Zelensky visited Canada and addressed their parliament. I don't know if this was because the war in Ukraine was losing support, justification amongst US policy makers internally. Nevertheless, any foreigner war keeps State Street, Vanguard, and BlackRock happy, rich, as they are heavily invested in defense manufacturers. With the whole Israel-Palestinian situation, everyone keeps saying that they support Palestinians and not Hamas. This statement seems a little superficial because one needs to keep in mind that every Hamas member is a Palestinian, but not all Palestinians are Hamas members. I also haven't seen any Palestinian civilians come out openly and denounce what Hamas is doing. This may be out of fear of the mainstream media does not bother to highlight them. Mm-hmm. And if Narad also has some questions, please, you may freely ask whenever you like.
Yes. I think both comments by Mahesh and Krishna are interesting, and these are angles definitely which one has to keep in mind. But I would like to do a kind of a deep dive to go into deeper psycho-spiritual roots of that region, the identity of Israel itself, and then from there understand the nature of this conflict which we are watching. And of course behind that will be the background, behind the conflict itself will be the background of all that we have been already discussing. Keep in mind that our goal is not a political, economic, social analysis, but a perspective which is primarily evolutionary and spiritual, which allows us more deeply to understand the political, economic or social circumstances, as well as underlying forces which push things in this direction. One of the problems I think everybody here on this, who's watching this, will face is this constant conflict pushed through the media, both independent as well as mainstream media, of Palestine versus Israel or Hamas versus Israel. And inevitably we have somebody swinging this way or that way. If you're a citizen of Israel, then you will say, yes, of course, Israel is on the right side. Or if you're a citizen of Palestine or have friends there or have seen videos of the suffering of children and women, you will say, they are being, they're oppressed and they need to be freed and so on. But we're going to try to look a little further behind. So in over the last couple of months, I've been looking at many videos which have been promoted across various platforms, pushing for both angles, sometimes looking at historical angles. And you'll find the videos which promote the Palestinian cause, which, if you have to summarize, is actually quite a horrible cause, because the cause actually states they want to eliminate Israel and all the Jews completely from Israel. So there's a problem even with that as a cause. But when you look at those videos, they will speak of the history after Constantinople and how Israel appears suddenly in the middle and pushes out the Palestinians, takes over land, and so on. But if you really look at the history, you can go further back, before Constantinople, before Islam appears on earth, before Christianity appears on earth, and you'll find Judaism very much present there. So the problem is the way the perspectives are gamed in these videos. So if you take logically to the conclusion, you would say, well, before Palestine or Islam appeared, it was already Israeli or Judaism, Hebrew space. And so anyone who came after should not be there, by that logic, applying the same logic. So it really does not take you much to get into all kinds of extreme positions. Rather, we will look at it from a deeper perspective. What is Israel really? And what is its place? So I had already quoted from the mother this very simple statement that she makes. This was at the time when 1967, when there were these conflicts happening already. Egypt was speaking of destroying Israel, and Israel had no right to exist. So it's a message the mother gave on 12th of June 1967. Simple one line: Israel as a nation has the same right to exist as all the other nations. And then if you look at what she speaks subsequently, it's quite interesting. There's a conversation that is there in... Somebody asked this question: how is one to explain this age-old enmity between the Jews and the Arabs, although having a common ancestor, hating each other, generation on generation, up to the impasse in which we have been living from some days back? That's the question. And mother's answer: perhaps the enmity exists only because they are neighbors. Violence and enmity. When brothers hate, they hate much more than others. Sri Aurobindo has said, and in quote, she says, hate is the indication of the possibility of a much greater love. So the questioner now asks, could we think that these two great peoples in conflict represent the symbolic forces called to decide the fate of our civilization? Mother's answer is very interesting. Of course, finally she says this has nothing to do with the fate of civilization. But it is not, so she answers, it is not this conflict that will decide the future of our civilization. The Musulmans and the Israelites represent the two religions where the faith in God is the most extreme. Only the faith of the Israelites is faith in an impersonal God, and the faith of the Musulmans is a faith of the personal God. So this is first difference in approach in the overall turn of philosophy, religion. But then, the Arabs have passionate natures. They live almost exclusively in the vital, with its passions, its desires, while the Israelites live chiefly in the mind, with a greater power of organization and of realization, which is quite exceptional. The Israelites are intellectual with a remarkable will. They are not sentimental. That is to say, they do not like weakness. The Musulmans are impulsive. The Israelites are rational. This is in June of 1967. Now this is a very simple response describing certain differences both in the turn of religion as well as in the temperament of their nature, and primary parts of nature upon which largely the groups, we are speaking of groups, not individuals who might be exceptions, on which they live or act from. And this gives us a profound insight. But it's not enough. We have to go a little further also into what does the emergence of Israel as a nation, now about less than 100 years ago, What does that represent? So we're going to look at this before we go actually into the discussion on the war itself as it is currently on. So first observation the mother makes, because they are brothers, they tend to be more intense in their hate or enmity, if there is enmity. Equally, there is the suggestion that when there is this excessive violence or enmity of brothers, it can show the possibility of a much greater love. And I'm going to actually suggest this because I have seen this in life, that there are citizens of Israel as well as citizens of neighboring areas who have been extremely good friends. And when you go deep enough, there is actually no significant point of difference between them. If the differences exist, it is about interpretation of some action or the other of others, but not among them. So in principle, if there were a certain shift in consciousness, eventually of course on both sides, then a much deeper bond of friendship and even mutual understanding could emerge. But there are things that come in the way, not only the differences in nature, but also certain ideological turns. And we will distinguish ideology from religion, and we'll come to that further shortly. But being neighbors now, the slightest differences tend to be exaggerated. But mother's observation, this is not so significant for the future of civilization or humanity. Having described their differences in the impersonal God and personal God as a faith, the next distinction she makes is of their natures. The Arabs have a passionate nature, living almost exclusively in the vital with its passions and desires. And now contrast this with the Israelites who live in the mind with a greater power of organization and realization, and then mother's words, which is quite exceptional, meaning already within overall humanity, it tends to stand out. It is exceptional. And you can actually see this. You can see this pretty much everywhere where people of that culture, civilization, racial descent have excelled in every sphere. I'm deliberately not using the word Jew because that is specific to a religious term, but I'm describing the temperament of the people of the Jewish origin, because many of them are not practicing Jews, but you will see them exceptional in the spheres of music, in science, as scientists, artists, creators, technologists, researchers, and so on. Today, even in the field of software, Israel is one of the leading countries. So you find this greater power of organization and of realization. There's always this turn to realizing in matter. That has its roots in the Judaism itself. Even though you are not a practicing Jew, the training that has come from that lineage and inheritance of your ancestral efforts to bring it to that level of material realization, that is a very strong imprint one sees. So also she says the Israelites are intellectuals with a remarkable will, and they are not sentimental, they do not like weakness. Now this also gives us an understanding of why when there is an attack against Israel, the reactions are also so strong, and sometimes it seems to be heartless. But it is extremely practical and applied to ensure that such a thing should not recur. And with that thinking, you will tend to be always excessive in response. There's another observation Sri Aurobindo makes. I couldn't get the quotation just now, but I will summarize it because it comes from this claim of Gandhi and his followers, which come from, let's say, the mentality of the Tolstoyan Christianity, that suffering purifies. And Sri Aurobindo says, no, it doesn't do that. It actually tends to make you more harsh. If you have suffered under others, you tend to become more harsh and deal with others below you in the same way that you were dealt with. And he points to the example of what's happening in between the Israelis and the Arabs. So this also gives us an understanding of this tendency when there is a strong intellect, remarkable will, practical results sought, long-term interest without too much sentiment and weakness, you tend to have that kind of a response. But inevitably, this third observation of the mother, the Israelites are rational, Musulmans are impulsive. And you will see this pattern again in the way the Palestinians or the other nearby countries have been repeatedly, impulsively reacting to so many things. Now, I'm placing this first as a psychological background, but then we will look at the direction it has taken, let's say, over a few thousand years. In another observation Sri Aurobindo makes, this is in the evening talks, he makes, again I'm summarizing, I don't have the exact quote here, he says the Jews are an intelligent race and it is inevitable that other people sometimes attack them simply because they're different or smarter. So this tendency also, he says, it's an animal instinct. When a new dog comes in the neighborhood, the older dogs will attack, and then if somebody is better than you, then you tend to attack, and these are very deep-rooted instincts. But when you live on impulses, when you live almost exclusively in the vital with its passions and desires, you're much more vulnerable to be manipulated by such things. And we have to keep this in mind when we understand how the Palestinian people have been manipulated, and we will see some of how the manipulation has taken place. But equally on the other side, if the Israelites are more rational, you can manipulate them with reason. But the method of manipulation is different for both. Equally, the response as a result of the manipulation is different because primarily living on different levels of consciousness. But now we go back to the history. And I said that if you go back long enough, you don't find Islam or Christianity present. You do find this Hebrew civilization. And I'm using this word more freely because the word Judaism or Jew has a problem very similar to what the word Hindu has in India. Is it a religious term? Is it a cultural term? Is it a racial term? Not very clear. But when you say Hebrew, then it's a more general context in which all these things are included as a civilizational space. So it is that phrase which Sri Aurobindo uses when he is describing the characteristic of the Hebrew civilization, and he describes how it was a civilization which lived for the ideal of the faithfulness to the law of God. Following the 10 Commandments, for example, is a law given to you by God supposedly, and you are faithful to that. And that kind of a dedication in pursuit to a certain set of ideas, you can see how automatically it turns the civilization towards thought. And the problem with any formulation of law is that you can always play with words. So necessarily when you're trying to follow a law diligently, you start arguing nuances. And then if you have a tradition which already describes more complex set of laws, then you're now seeing conflict of laws, which is inevitable. This is the whole problem of why we have judges and courts, because the moment you mentalize a truth and you reduce it to forms of words, it clashes, because it's no more truth, it's now pieces, and pieces of truth will always end up in conflict. So inevitably in the Jewish tradition, the students, the scholars of the tradition go into deep analysis. This text says that text says that, how do we interpret this, ways of interpretation, and playing with ideas, playing with words, concepts, and it makes for, sustained over a few generations, an exaggeration of the power of the intellect and skillful use of the intellect. But also because it is always turned to practice, because you have to follow in life the law of God, there is this practical turn which comes in the civilization. And I'm saying this is happening pretty much in that whole region. It's not just limited to that one, let's say, religion, but it's an imprint in that whole region. And from that region, it influences Greece, Rome, and modern Europe. Sri Aurobindo's observation about this is quite interesting. And I want to look at this next, where he says, this is a quotation from The Ideal of Human Unity. And here he says, he's looking at the past, going back quite a bit, a couple of thousand years, maybe more. If we consider the past of humanity so far as it is known to us, we find that the interesting periods of human life, the scenes in which it has been most richly lived and has left behind it the most precious fruits, were precisely those ages and countries in which humanity was able to organize itself in little independent centers, acting intimately upon each other but not fused into a single unity. This insight is amazing. It's not just about history, it's also telling you things about present. You see, that whole book, Ideal of Human Unity, is also a book on management. It's also a book on administration. But you have to really understand, because he goes to root principles, he's telling you everything. So just this principle, many small units not fused in a single unity, but working together with interaction, is how today you see startups and the startup culture, which is the most innovative culture today. It's when they combine or they are bought up by these big companies that they lose this rich, interesting creativity, and they become more monotone. So what you're seeing in the past, and he's describing history in terms of small units, culturally, civilizationally, of startups, which each having a small independent center and then acting upon each other and influencing each other. Then he makes this very fascinating observation. Modern Europe owes 2/3 of its civilization to 3 such supreme moments of human history. This is 2/3 of its civilization to 3 moments. What is that additional 1/3? We don't look at now. So what are these 3 supreme moments of human history? The religious life of the congeries of tribes which called itself Israel, and subsequently of the little nation of the Jews. The many-sided life of the small Greek city-states, and similarly, though more restricted artistically and intellectual life of medieval Italy. So, Israel and Jews, small Greek city-states, and artistic and intellectual life of medieval Italy. These are the 3 things, supreme moments of human history, he says, to which Europe, modern Europe, owes 2/3 of its civilization. Now you have to really think deeply about it. We will not have time to go into all the implications, but I would leave it as an exercise to you. But when he is describing Israel and the Jews, he describes already 2 phases in them. First, there is this religious life of the congeries of tribes which called itself Israel. So here's a collection of tribes. Each tribe has its distinctive identity, and yet the group together calls itself Israel. And you have to understand, when you're tribes, the collective identity across lives is not yet, across the tribes, is not yet fully organized. And subsequently of the little nation of the Jews. Now that has become more organized, and a little nation of the Jews, again Israel, which does not last too long, because by then Christianity has come in, which has turned against Judaism at some point, and then Islam has come in, which has turned even more violently against Judaism and even Christianity. The result is that this little nation of the Jews does not get a very stable, long survival. It is constantly under stress. Eventually, there is a migration, and so on. I don't go into the history of it. But you must understand, at this point, the nation identity is already present, was already present during this phase of the congeries of tribes. But it had not acquired externally an organizational framework. You look, I'm going to compare this with India. In India, when the British left, technically there were about 300 princely states. Some of the states were as small as a district today, which is actually for India very small, but for Europe it's often bigger than a small country of Europe. Nevertheless, if you look at each of these, each has its own distinctive characteristics, language, dress code, food, specialities of cultural forms, dance, etc. And yet from the beginning even, going back at least 5,000 years with the Mahabharata in particular, the sense of a nation identity has emerged. Sri Aurobindo even describes the Mahabharata as an event which was largely let's say, orchestrated by Sri Krishna with the intention of welding together all these, let's say, disparate kingdoms into one whole to prepare the base of the nation that is India or Bharat. Look at the timelines involved. The seeds are laid 5,000 years ago. That's the dating of the Mahabharata, by the way. And there's no dispute about this because it's an astronomical dating. The current history, as the British formulated it, is not based on any evidence. It's just a fanciful date they put to make India somehow less old than Greece and Rome. But 5,000 years ago, the seeds are laid, framework created, and through great bloodshed and destruction, a unity is forged. Not yet a nation, but the formation of the nation has begun. You could say at that point, spiritually it was always a nation. Culturally it now begins to integrate and eventually becomes a political unity now about 70 years ago. You see the timeline. Something similar you see happening with this congeries of tribes and subsequently the little nation of the Jews, but its stabilization in a single physical space is thwarted because of this scattering of the people. Nevertheless, wherever these Jewish people spread, they formed their own little focal points, which became a problem also because they were easy to target. I remember when I went to Poland, we were driving into the city, and the driver was talking, narrating, here is this, here is that. And then he said, on this side of the river, you see these are the such and such quarters. That side of the river are the Jewish quarters. So I said, why are the Jewish quarters separate on the other side of the river? He didn't know. He goes, I don't know, but I think they like to stay by themselves separately. Maybe that's one part of the story. The other part of the story was also that in Europe, when the church turned against Judaism, there was this problem which came of the church sponsored attacks and hatred. I'm surprised to see that even today there are so many Christian groups which openly speak of Christ being killed by the Jews and so on, and therefore they are cursed. And to me this sounds very similar to what you see in Afghanistan, where you have these tribes fighting each other across a few centuries because your great-great-grandfather insulted my great-great-grandmother or something of that kind. That mentality. And that's why I'm distinguishing the ideology from the religion. This ideology which looks at the past and identifies with an event of the past that has no relevance to the present and attacks another descendant of a past to which this descendant has no relevance or relation and sustains a hatred. This is an ideological issue. This is what you will see even today with many of the countries around Israel and between the Hamas and Israelis. But that mentality in the Middle Ages in Europe was sustained, at least in certain pockets, quite extreme. But if you look at the nature of this nation soul, if the nation soul has to come fully forward and organize itself in the life of the people, in order to be able to most completely manifest its distinctive gifts, and every nation has its own unique gifts to share for humanity, then the transition from the tribal stage to the national consciousness requires a sufficiently stable physical space. And therefore it was inevitable that in some form or other Israel had to found itself as a nation somewhere on earth. When I look, for example, at the situation in Tibet today, if you see the essence of the religious, spiritual framework of what Tibet had to give going back a couple of hundred years is no more in Tibet today. Today, Tibet is largely filled with the Han Chinese and it's been turned into a showpiece. And for a long time I thought maybe it has just gone into the domain of ideas, but when I was visiting a particular community, a Tibetan community in California, so we were in their retreat space, and across the valley on the other side, on the other mountain, on a small hill maybe, was their actual home. Their teacher, as well as a whole group of their monks in a monastery. And looking at it from far, you literally felt the memory in consciousness of Tibet in the Himalayas. It was so amazing, and it's not just many of us, we all felt it. Yes, of course, this is the consciousness of Tibet, the spiritual, religious consciousness of Tibet, and it was held there. I'm sure this is not the only place, there may be others. If ever someday this consciousness has to again reassemble and play its real role in the world, it will need a physical space. Maybe it may come back at some point in the Tibetan region, or it may stay in such a space and this may become the new little Tibet. I'm pointing this out because the exact physical location may not be so critical, but certainly it is helpful if that location is historically in the same space where the culture and civilization emerged. So when in, I think the Balfour Declaration, 1914, I may be off on the dates, but the Balfour Declaration is when the British government decided that there was going to be an Israel and a physical space. And at that time it was the Rothschild, one of the bankers, and today well known as a cabal banker, but still, but he agreed to fund because he has the resources. And finally, 1948, after the Second World War, formally Israel is established with an agreement made in which the lands owned by the British at that point would be equally divided between Israel and the Palestinians. And the division was made equally. What happened is soon after the British left, the other countries around attacked Israel. Israel pushes back and then keeps extra land as a buffer space. And every time there was an attack, subsequently there were several, it would extend the scope of the land as a buffer space and widen itself. Now I'm pointing to this not in terms of whether it is justified or not, but in terms of the psychology which we discussed earlier of the Jewish people or the Israeli people. Every time there's an attack, you push back. Now this is a negotiating skill which is used in extreme kinds of negotiation where one person is very dominant and has all power. So he says, okay, I make you this offer. You accept or reject. If you hum and haw or refuse once and then come back and say, all right, now I accept, he'll say, too late. Now that offer is off the table. Now I give you a less interesting offer. And each time you back off and come back, it becomes less interesting. He literally bullies you into accepting an offer and stop negotiation. But this can only be done when somebody is strong enough to be able to do that. But what I'm showing you is a tendency which comes from a psychological mold. On the other side, the need to constantly attack, the need to declare the destruction of Jews and the elimination of all Jews and so on, which is, by the way, on the Hamas website. They want to kill all Jews. Very simple. And when you have these statements which are being touted in universities across the world with the flags of Palestine and Hamas, and they will say from the chant which is taught, and I said last time, overnight everyone was chanting the same chant. You know that it's orchestrated. The chant was, from river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Now, river to sea means literally the entire space, including what is Israel today. The entire space, the Israeli people have to be killed or go. And that again is contrary to the agreements which had been made at that point. And so there is no real rationale for this, but it becomes a sentimental, impulsive chant and repeating a chant. You will see all these people who do demonstrations, they will take such a rhyme and rhythm of chant and make everyone repeat it. You remember it's one of the techniques of hypnosis. And the rhyme and rhythm puts a great power into it, and then if the persons who formulate it link it to some other force, all those who are chanting it, they get as if possessed by that force or come under its influence. This is the power of the mantra and the force infused into a mantra. Now here are people, young people, chanting this, who have zero background of the history of the Jewish people, of Israel, of the Hebrew civilization, of whatever events have passed for this nation to organize itself. And when you start repeating this chant and attuned to whatever it is, you end up believing it to a degree that you're passionate about it. And so I'm going to be very frank, if any of you have been in that mold, be careful, because what I'm saying may cause triggers, emotional reactions, visceral reactions. The moment you find a reaction which is not rational, it is visceral, be careful, it's the result of programming. Consciously disengage from it, because this is not your soul's perception. This is not even a reasonable or rational perception. It's a programming and a hypnotic programming. So you may say, I have never been hypnotized. It's irrelevant. The technique of hypnosis and mass hypnosis does not require you to go to sleep. It just formulates a thought form and infuses it so deep, it feels like yours. So be careful not to be triggered by this. I'm trying to enter into a deeper understanding of things. The actual specifics of the conflict of what happened, we will look at only after we understand this more deeply. So if you ask yourself, what is it that the Hebrew tradition has brought in terms of influence on Europe? So I've described certain elements of the mindset and the culture, but you will see also, particularly in relation with Christianity and Islam, the influence is very important. If you speak today anywhere and say, I'm going to study the Bible, the inevitable thought you will have is the Christian Bible, the church Bible. No, the word Bible is actually a Jewish word, part of the Judaism tradition, which Christianity took from it. And what is called the Old Testament is part of the original, let's say, Judaism Bible, which then was edited and modified, some portions added, removed, and then the new portion called the New Testament, and so on. But why is it called the Bible? The word itself goes back to library of books of learning. So the teaching itself, largely of Christianity, goes back to Judaism and draws from it, including the idea of a Messiah. So while Judaism looked forward to a Messiah, Christianity declared Christ is that Messiah, which Orthodox Judaism does not accept. They still wait for someone else. That's irrelevant. But the idea of it, the whole conceptual turn of the religion, is largely drawn from Judaism. What's new, what is distinctive, is Christ's attempt to differentiate between what was earlier the angry God, the jealous God, and the God-fearing culture of the religion, from what Christ tried to bring as a loving God and love for God. And so that's when the vocabulary comes where he says, that is your God, my God is a God of love, and so on. But he's a Jew, he's born a Jew, he lives a Jew, he dies a Jew. So in a sense, you could look at Christ's teaching as an attempt to reform Judaism or bring into it a dimension of love for God and so on. Why is this so important? Because you will see the elements of it are very significant. Sri Aurobindo makes reference to them, and I'm going to read from this, from Sri Aurobindo's Thoughts and Aphorisms. The Jew invented the God-fearing man. India, the God-knower and God-lover. So you can see two different parts of the earth. God-fearing, the other side God-knowing, God-loving. Next, Sri Aurobindo says in the next aphorism, the servant of God was born in Judea, but he came to maturity among the Arabs. India's joy is in the servant lover. If you think about this deeply, you are looking at stages in human evolution where certain spiritual principles are being, so to say, infused into humanity. So, servant of God is born in Judea, but came to maturity among the Arabs. Now, this gives you a clue of the relationship of Islam with Judaism. So, servant of God, because remember, you are following the commands of God. You're serving God. But in Islam, you find this taking a form which is much more, let's say, organized in the form of the religion as a priority. And so you see the name Islam itself meaning surrender, surrender to God, surrender to the will of God. Today, popularly, they will say Islam means peace. No, Islam means surrender. You can give it other meanings, but this is what it means originally. So, but he came to maturity among the Arabs. Why? Because the entire religion is built on this. And the mentality of the Orthodox Muslim is literally serving God. The moment, though, your link with God is no more direct, but through a book, through an interpreter of a book, through the local priest, who then tells you what the book means, and if you have not been taught to read, even he tells you even what is in the book, then you have an opportunity for somebody in between to hijack. And then declare that God wants you to kill so and so, wants you to hate so and so on, and it can take a very different turn. So again, I'm looking at the ideology here. It does not matter if the book says it also. I've seen videos where Muslims will say, oh, because the Quran tells me to kill those who are non-believers. Yes, of course, you'll find that in the text. You have seen videos of an Orthodox Jew who says, the Torah tells me that you are an idol worshipper, so it is my responsibility to kill you. But is that what you live by? Because this is where the ideology comes. A refined development of mind will say, yes, that was perhaps relevant to a certain context, it's not relevant today, and that's not what the will of God represents. So what you find in Judaism is something very interesting. You will find many streams of Judaism today, 4 or 5 different things, and all of them, with the exception of one which is extremely orthodox and literal, all of them tend to be evolutionary in that they try to reinterpret in the current context, give a higher meaning and move forward, and even some of them discard the specifics of formal text, but try to catch the spirit of it and put that into practice. And this makes all the difference. And this becomes possible because quite a large portion of the practitioners live more in the mind than in the impulsiveness of passion. But if on the other side you've been brought up from childhood with this text only, and you're brought up with the impulsiveness of passion, you're taught to be impulsive and passionate about whatever it is that you've been told, then you can see which direction that would take, and the two will not be able to meet, they will not be able to speak to each other, because they live by completely different values. Now it's a fact that in large parts of what is presently the Palestine or in the Gaza Strip, in large parts there are children who have grown up having read nothing except the Quran. Even that, not entirely, only portions which they were taught. And for them to even know that there are other books or other ways of looking at things is so revolutionary, it is scary. Now you can see how a group like that can be so easily manipulated to live in hate and by hate. And so you have on the Hamas website this declaration that all the Jews have to be killed, and that's it. The moment you take such a position, you're obviously in the wrong. But it's not enough that you take a milder position. That mentality, that ideology itself has to undergo a change. But I come back to this. When you are a servant of God, even matured sufficiently in the way it is done, but your link with God is now cut off and an intermediary put, you can be hijacked in your servitude. Whereas in the more mystical elements of the Islamic tradition, as in the Sufi tradition, the attempt is to relate to God directly. And there all these problems tend to fade away. Because now you want to relate and enter in the direct communion with the mystical experience. But still the question will come. I'm digressing from the theme, but it's an important point because it's there at the back of the mind. Why this God-fearing relationship? And servitude to God, but with God-fearing, what's the point of it? Does it really have a place in evolution? And this is only Sri Aurobindo can give us an answer which is so insightful, because he shows you the justification for everything, including what may seem to be almost an error. So I go back to aphorisms earlier, 3 aphorisms before, but in a different sequence. He writes, to fear God really is to remove oneself to a distance from Him. But to fear Him in play gives an edge to utter delightfulness. It's too profound to elaborate right now, but dwell upon it, maybe reread it. So if it had just stopped with fear of God, it distances you from God. But if you have a deep, intimate relationship in play, and in that there is the fear, now it's no more the regular kind of fear, it gives an edge to utter delightfulness. That is the truth of that. Otherwise, it becomes a falsehood and a distortion of the relationship with the divine. And so I will leave this point here for the other observations of the mother. Now we come back to this point of Israel and the mother's observation when Israel is established, and now the President Nasser of Egypt had declared that he wanted the destruction of Israel. And the mother's comment at that point, Satprem says, poor Israel. And mother says, oh, it's disgusting. There's another disgusting story. And then Satprem's comment, oh yes, the business is trumped up from start to finish. And India. Mother says, bah. And the comment is because, so then Satprem says, but that India ought to be the spokesperson of something a little truer. It's painful. Because at that point, India refused to recognize Israel. This was under the Nehruvian policies at that point. And mother's observation, very interesting. Where does that come from, that Nehruvian mentality? She says, oh, that's because the natural tendency here is against the Muslims. So those who think they are superior say one should be above one's dislikes. Let's be with them. Mother laughs. There's the logic of it. This is the Gandhian and Nehruvian mentality. And so it was as if the official position of India was not recognizing Israel and so on. This remained for a long time. It's only when BJP came to power that this changed. And under Modi, the relationship with Israel have been not only completely normalized, but a deep partnership has been developed, which is a natural alliance because of the civilizational values which are shared. So this gives you a background now of the civilizational turn and the inevitability of an Israel as a nation in a physical space being established. That being the case, 1948, it's interesting. 1947, India becomes formally a nation. As a political unit, Israel forms as a political unit a year later. Looking back at the last, let's say, 100 years, is when all these nation structures come into their own in prominence in a significant way. Before that, the build-up of the nation unit was happening psychologically, spiritually. And so something significant has happened in the last 100 years, of which the full formation of the nation unit is not yet complete. But we're still in the process of the struggles of integration and unification on a deeper national value and identity, which eventually must become the spiritual soul of the nation and not just its cultural forms. There's another comment of the mother regarding this thing. She's speaking of an American who is marveling Israel, and he says it's a marvel of brotherhood and sense of organization. And he asks whether this isn't the beginning of a future realization. And then mother says, they clearly are very receptive. I saw it straight away. When I was told that the Egyptians, and in particular this president, had decreed that the Israeli nation must disappear, I straight away saw there was a very strong reaction. Mother laughs. It brought about quite a categorical result. What she's saying very subtly, there was a reaction in her consciousness, in her universal consciousness. Somebody says Israel must disappear, and within her universal consciousness there was this reaction, and immediately it had its result in Israel and on the circumstances there. That's why she says they clearly are very receptive. So this is again a deeper insight. I look at one more comment. Okay, I think we'll leave that part for now. So, having come to this understanding that here is something which is a civilizational value, it's a national the formation of the nation and the national soul having a chance now to organize itself in human life, we see how this influence grows. I read Sri Aurobindo's comment of how this has influenced modern Europe. And I want to point to one such influence. And I'm not saying it's the only one, but one such which to me always stands out in a very significant way. Coming as I am from a background of physical science also. So you will see in Europe, before the age of reason and the intellectual age which threw out the Christian church religion and so on being irrational, there was the law of God which Europe followed. And Sri Aurobindo's observation is so fascinating. He says, it is with the same intensity with which Europe dedicated itself to this following the Bible and the church teachings and the law of God and so on, it is with the same intensity that when it threw out the church and God, it followed now the law of science. Very interesting. So it's almost this kind of a religious fervor which now becomes turned to the physical sciences with the same kind of fervor. So what happened in that transition was fascinating. What were earlier seen as laws of God, the concept stays, now it becomes laws of nature. So in the physical sciences as they came now with God discarded and anything subtle and occult thrown out, reality is reduced to matter. Now you have laws of nature. And you would ask, who in nature forms the laws? Who maintains the laws? Who ensures they are followed? Which would have been explained earlier by God. Now you've thrown out God, but nature takes the place of God in a way. And nature has as if an intelligence of its own, implicit. Of course, none of this is explicitly stated, but implicit to the idea of law of nature. And then from there, eventually even that becomes awkward because you are extremely rational. You can't speak of nature because you can't speak of intelligence of nature. So it becomes laws of science. And that's how it's taught today in textbooks. And this is the European science mentality. It's a law of physics, law of biology, law of chemistry. They don't go further. They don't go into law of psychology. Even biology is, they don't use the word law. They will say tendencies. But physics and chemistry particularly, they are laws. Which means what? Which means somewhere in the physical world, something decided it should be thus. Some power and intelligence ensures it is thus. We don't even know what that is. But in the claim that it's a law, this is what you have implicitly stated. So it becomes as if a religious belief in itself. Why is it so? That's the law of physics. How does it explain? Nothing. It just describes. So this is one of the trends which comes from that civilization where you had to be absolute in obedience to the law of God. Now you are recognizing the whole world as formed by this law of not God but nature or science. But the absolute obedience and pursuit of that law is still the same tendency. You see, it's interesting to observe. And then you find the turn of mind to philosophize and to have the beauty of thoughts and so on, that comes from the Greece. And then the artistic turn in the physical turn of the arts comes from the Italian influence, and you get 2/3 of Europe, of modern Europe. The balance 1/3, we have to see what are the sources. So I'm looking at this now from the big picture, and you see where Israel is. Now, where is Palestine? If you look at the region itself, all the past Palestinians were Jewish at one time, perhaps converted to Christianity or Islam later. So if you go back to the history, there might have been no big conflict, or there might have been a conflict between two subgroups of the same, let's say, religion or culture or ethnic type, or two differences of ethnic types now colliding because of whatever triviality of differences. But now it so happens this is Islamized. Is Islam the problem or the ideology which teaches you to kill the other or hate the other? So equally, as I've said, we have examples of Muslims who say, no, we don't have a problem, we are actually good friends. The fact that Trump could negotiate the Abraham Accords with these other 4 countries, with Israel, to be completely friendly in their relations, political, economic, social, and exchange even without visas. Shows you Islam inherently, if it has been sufficiently, let's say, mentalized and freed from that impulsive and cruder form of translation or interpretation. Islam inherently need not have this problem. It's more the ideological turn which has the problem. So this is where we come now to the situation which happened with Palestine and now specifically Hamas. One of the slogans you will find repeated all over in these demonstrations is free Palestine from Israel. What does that mean? Implied is that Israel is somehow ruling Palestine and preventing the Palestinian people from living their free life. Now, this may have been partly true up to a certain stage. I don't go into the full history. As I've said, there were several wars, several attacks. Each time Israel pushed back, and one thing very important took place with the PLO, which was constantly attacking Israel, and they went after the PLO also, and we know many of the fascinating stories. Eventually, the PLO came to an agreement and they decided to make peace. And this is extremely important. This took place about nearly 30 years ago. Subsequently, though, there were always these elements. Now, these elements which come up and say, no, we hate, no, you have to go, etc., came to a point where Israel said, all right, if that's what you want and if this is what will give you the satisfaction of freedom, we will move out completely from the Gaza area. So in 2005, Israel withdrew entirely from the Gazan region, took away everything which was theirs, in the sense that including their graves. Now this goes to certain religious beliefs, not important, but had the graves been left behind, they feared that certain of the ideological extremists would even desecrate the graves just to spite the Jewish people. So they even took away the graves, left everything behind, gave them economic backing, economic support, technology transfers, created jobs. It's a huge number. 500,000 people from the Gazan area cross the border every day to work in Israel and come back in the evening to earn their living. So they thought, here we give you freedom, you rule yourself, govern yourself. Anyway, now there's peace, there's no more the PLO attacking us. And we give you economic incentives, we give you the technology transfers, educational framework, whatever you need. Now this was the agreement reached, and Israel withdrew totally. What happens next is what you have to understand is the real problem. In the next elections that took place, it was the Hamas that came to power. The Hamas, having come to power, ensured that they could never be removed from power. So it's a little like what happens when you see pretty much everywhere in the world, even in India. Once the communists come to power, they subvert the whole selection process, election process, and cancel our elections or subvert to such a degree they can never be thrown out. You see the same thing happen in Ukraine. The democratically elected government in 2014 was overthrown in a coup by Zelensky, backed by, at the time, the US Deep State Department. They overthrew a democratically elected government. And then Zelensky settles in. He gets elected the second time around, whatever the circumstance, fine. But now, because the next elections are due, he has just cancelled them because he knows he's going to lose. So this tendency should be a red flag for you. And this is exactly what happened with the Hamas. Hamas now takes over all the funding that comes, and I mentioned last time some $700+ million, which is just one of the official figures from the US, and there are many others, NGOs and other sources. And all that happens with that money, no improvement in education, no improvement in basic civil necessities, all that goes into building underground bunkers, tunnels, fancy, expensive elevators for the underground bunkers. Think about how much money could have gone in developing. And if you look at the statistics of population, very large number of children. There was no attempt to control the population growth to something which is reasonable. Ensuring that through this is an exaggeration of poverty, because now two parents, even assuming one is working or even if both are working, don't have enough money to feed so many, there will always be endemic poverty. They're not given a proper education, which again, with all that money, one could have done so much more. You are left on a level which is practically illiterate and therefore incapable of earning more. You see, in today's circumstance, you can even earn money online, doing all kinds of things online, if you have that capability of education. None of that is given. As I said, there are actually large parts in the Gazan region where all they know is the Quran, and that too just learned by heart. What happens next is, over the next, from 2005, 2006 they come to power till now, over these, let's say, 17 years, all the money goes into building the infrastructure for attacking Israel and increasing the hatred of Israel. Now, I've seen again videos, and these are promoted even by those who support the Palestine cause, who will say that you see the Israelis shoot the children. So they'll show adults and children taking stones on a sling, large stones on a sling, swirling and throwing it across the wall into the Jewish quarters, hoping it will kill somebody. And every now and then you hear a shot ringing out at a distance, and occasionally one of these persons is injured and taken away to the hospital. This is presented as the perversion of the Israeli army. When I looked at the video, the first question was, who is teaching these young children to throw stones to want to kill somebody whom they have never met and they have no reason to hate? And the adults standing by, provoking the children, goading them to throw the stones in order to be hit eventually at some point by the bullets, and recording this for propaganda purpose. You have to understand the mentality here. The mentality is to record the creation of a victim in order to promote a certain message at the cost of your own family. This is how it is. What you saw also in the conflict with Hamas, the Hamas people, and I'm not speaking of Palestinians, the Hamas put the Palestinian children and women in front when they shot their missiles or when they shot with their guns, so that if Israel retaliates, it will hit first this human shield, which then is recorded and promoted on the internet. On the other side, Israel put its women and children in protection, and its soldiers come in front to defend them. The picture is literally a mirror image of values, where here the soldiers come in front to protect and defend the vulnerable. On the other side, the vulnerable are put in front to protect and defend the attackers. And I'm again showing you the ideological shift. This is very disturbing, because it means on some level you're willing not only to die because you've been told that you will have certain rewards in heaven, but you're willing to see your own children and women be killed. I don't know what is the reward they would get, but that mentality to me is extremely dangerous. It's one thing to say, I will kill the other because I hate. It's another thing to say, I will allow my own people to be killed because I hate the other. That is deeply disturbing. And you have to understand this difference. If you don't, then you will not understand, you will not be able to see through the propaganda. Who does that? And the answer to that is not very comfortable. And this is the culture which had been set in the last, let's say, 17 years when Palestine was ruled by Hamas. So if you really took this phrase, free Palestine, you must understand they were already free from Israelis. They were ruled by Hamas. If you want to free Palestine, free them from Hamas. Can you do that? All the funding you send to help Palestine goes into the hands of the Hamas. I mentioned that last time. A month before this attack took place, the US government, the Biden government had given them $70 million. And just after the attack, they promised another, I don't remember, 50, 80 million. But with the warning saying you will not use it for arms. Who's in control? Another news item I saw recently, the funding that was coming to Hamas through the Muslim Brotherhood. And it was George Soros, Open Societies Foundation, funding Muslim Brotherhood, which was transferring funds to Hamas. So many sources of funding. To what end? And what utility? What is the mindset, ideology which has seized and perverted good people and enslaved them? So the enslavement of the mind, the enslavement of the deeper soul values and replacing by something perverse, that's what you need to free from. And as of 2005, you cannot say it has anything to do with Israel. They moved out saying, here's your full freedom, you can do what you like. There is another factor again. People will say, yes, but they were prevented from going outside that zone. Yes, because the moment the freedom was allowed, the first thing they did was attack or bring arms. So what Israel had to do was to create a region, a zone in the Mediterranean on the outside the Gaza region, a large region, I don't remember, 10 or 7 kilometers into the water, where they can freely go fishing, but if they have to cross that boundary, there will be a check. For what? To prevent smuggling of arms. But nothing to prevent trade, nothing to prevent growth of economy. So the obsession with arms to be imported in Gaza region is something you have to really stop to think. Why wasn't the same energy used to develop economically? Now all this is to set a background of why this happened. But again, I will take it a step further and say, once the arms had been piled up, once the underground bunkers created, once the equipment set, once people trained to kill, and you must understand, Hamas was training people going back 10 years at least, how to kill, including the hang gliders and drones and other things. When this training was happening, and they released videos showing this, they released videos where they had houses which were replicas of the kibbutz and how the terrorists would go in to kill people and so on. The training papers which have been seized clearly declare, kill as many, get as many hostages as you can. Very simple. This mentality has been going on and drilled in. Let's say it's a minority, for argument's sake. I don't know. So let's assume it's a minority. But this training has been going on for a long time. And what happens to the rest of the family? It's not that they're immune to it. And when this becomes long enough, is the people discriminating enough to refuse it, or do they blindly accept it? If they're still blindly accepting it, then this is inevitable what's going to follow. If they're refusing it, there will be a pushback, and maybe they're threatened and so they're afraid to refuse. Then it's a different story. Overnight the situation can change once the Hamas leadership is eliminated. Just as ISIS was knocked out, literally overnight, because of the elimination of top leadership, the same might happen here. In which case all that Israel is doing to finish off the Hamas leadership is justified. But if that ground level people have not changed their approach, elimination of the top leadership will do nothing, the whole thing would repeat. Which one it is, I don't know. I don't know enough about the ground reality, but I'm just showing you in terms of consciousness what would be the outcome and the causes of this event. Now let's forward a few steps. Over these years the preparation has been made. They are now ready to attack. When do they attack? How do they choose a date? As has happened traditionally and as would be the military thinking naturally, the attack is when the enemy is weakest. There's a holiday, less people on the border, people have gone home, they're not expecting it, or even if they expect and you attack, it takes them longer to retaliate and so on. Now all this is being done by an intelligence, a very advanced intelligence. As I mentioned last time, Iran is a significant financier and trainer, the Quds division particularly, which was the foreign affairs organization whose Soleimani head Trump eliminated. So they were involved with Hamas as well as Hezbollah and others. So there's a planning that's taking place across national boundaries. There are satellite images tracking. But what's happening inside Israel? Now here comes something extremely important, because Without this understanding, you will not understand how such a massacre could take place on the border, which is the most guarded in the whole world. Israel has such tight protection. There is facial recognition for everybody who crosses. Remember, 500,000 people are crossing every day. So you cannot risk it. Even if 10 people go in who are terrorists, you can have a massacre. Because once they are in Israel, they are totally free. So you have to ensure it's the right people and the people who you trust, and there are no weapons that come across. So they have the most tightly guarded border. They have people who are taking turns among citizens, watching video cameras over days, over weeks, and they take turns, and there's never one person. In case one person sleeps, there are two others. So there's a triple layer of redundancy, watching everything that's happening across the border with their cameras, including the Palestinians who are doing their farming. And about a month before, some of these watchers, and they've come out publicly stating this, they observed that suddenly the farmers had changed. People they had been seeing coming days together suddenly had gone, and absolute strangers were there who were not familiar with farming, and they raised red flags. In the defense system, every circumstance, every possibility has been thought of and counters prepared. And even if the counters fail, there's a second backup and a third backup. At best, there's a delay of a few minutes. A helicopter gunship, at worst, can come within 5 minutes. Airplanes can bomb within a short time, etc. It took 7 hours for the Israeli military to come back with any kind of pushback. This is unexplained. So they keep saying intelligence failure. So the media made a big deal about it for a couple of days, and then finally the Israeli army leadership said, we will discuss this later, let's not waste time on this thinking, we should now do what is required to defend. So the matter was shelved and the mainstream media stopped talking about it. The reality is more complex. What actually happened involves layers within, and for this you must go back to the previous discussions we have had about the cabal, deep state, and anti-evolutionary interests. And if you don't have this background, you will not understand what happened here. So you understand within the Israeli intelligence there are factions. There are factions which are aligned to the global cabal, which want war, and they profit from it. There are factions which truly love their country and do not want war. They want peace, they want their country to prosper and be friendly with their neighborhoods. And the same within the political class, and the same within the administrative groups, and so on. Those of you who have actually been following global affairs more closely, you would have known that for the last 2 years at least, there's a huge internal division in Israel. There are two groups, and the media, mainstream media, is against Netanyahu. So I'm assuming the other side is controlled by cabal, and Netanyahu was trying to change something which cabal does not like. What was the point? The point of contention was the Supreme Court of Israel. Now, Israel does not have a constitution, interestingly. It has traditions, it has rules from past precedent, and that's about it. They don't have a formal constitution. So the Supreme Court, when it passes a judgment, does not have a reference of an objective document. Now, Israel is one of 5 countries which does not have this. They just go by precedent. So what happened was, every time a group of the political people under Netanyahu and those who were genuinely nation-loving, I'm avoiding the word nationalist, they are nation-loving, they wanted to make certain changes to improve certain situations, the Supreme Court would arbitrarily strike down those changes, saying this is not in the spirit of Israel. What does that mean? There's nothing objective. This is not worthy of our culture. Knocked out. But there's no objective reference on which you can say this and not that. So it was almost on whimsical basis that the Supreme Court was rejecting these changes which were considered to be essential for the long-term well-being of the country, which Netanyahu was pushing. So at some point this group said, that's enough, we have to curtail the power of the Supreme Court. We can't have the whims and fancies of a few old judges overriding national interest and reason. So they began to initiate a formal change in laws to curtail the powers of the Supreme Court so that the elected representatives would be able to push through, maybe with a majority, certain essential changes. Now at this point you have to understand the cabal, deep state perhaps within Israel kicks in. It wants to protect its interests. It began to violently attack Netanyahu. There were widespread public demonstrations against him for wanting to reform the Supreme Court. Now, if you think about it, that's not a good logical reason. And yet this was being pushed by the media. For a long time I was watching these headlines saying, oh, riots or demonstrations in Israel. About what? Oh, about this man who wants to reform the Supreme Court. Why? What were the issues? Never mentioned in the mainstream media, for which you have to go into alternate media to understand what was really happening. But I'm giving you this example, this point first, because you see a major division which had been building up for the last 2 years between two interest groups. Now these interest groups, you have to understand, are aligned in opposite directions. Cabal interests which want global one world government and wars. The other which is national interest which want peace, but each nation to be independent. Here what happens is, under Joe Biden, there were certain alignments of interests which began to fund or support the other group in a way which was compromising their intelligence gathering capability. Now the full scope of this I will not go into. I have left a link here which is a talk by one Patrick Byrne. You can look at in detail, but I'm going to summarize what happened next. Because of these interests, and they were mostly financial interests and other Netanyahu is pushed back by this group, and this group now warns, and officially they warn him, saying that if you continue like this to pressure the Supreme Court to reform, then there will be a shutdown of the intelligence capability, and 10,000 people in the intelligence will refuse to cooperate with you, and you will have a blind spot of intelligence beginning end of September. This is declared going back a few months, threatening the Prime Minister of the country to say, intelligence community won't back you and you will have a blind spot, you will be open to attacks. Imagine the, I'm sorry to use the word perversion implied. That means you're threatening the Prime Minister that we're going to allow others to attack us because you're not doing what we want, or you're doing something we don't want, rather. You're trying to reform the Supreme Court and we don't want you to touch our power to override you. That's what it came to. So they threaten this. Netanyahu goes ahead, and towards the end of August, he pushes through a minimal of reforms. As a result, the blind spot is activated. There's a group within the intelligence community which had warned of this. Now we don't know actual numbers. The person who was threatening publicly declared 10,000. I don't know what the actual number would be. But they actually weakened the cyber capabilities of the intelligence community, and some decision was taken to allow. Now this does not happen in isolation. You can't just say, we will sit back and allow an attack and the attack happens. It has to coordinate with another group which is ready with the attack and has been for years but has been waiting. So that's why I say there is a cabal connection here. Cabal says enough of this and we need another war. I'll point out there are many more reasons why the cabal wanted the war. But it would have activated other links. And if you understand the global connection between these interests, even if it is short term, the timing is perfect. There's a shutdown of intelligence, blind spot activated, and within 1 week or 10 days, this Hamas attack takes place. Now, when the attack took place, like I said, there were signs of it already happening. So this lady who was one of the watchers, she's put this in public on the video. She says, I informed my superior in the military and I was given a stand down order. I was told, don't interfere, don't bother. Hamas has no value. They are going to do nothing. On the ground, soldiers who were sending messages to higher up in the military found that there was no response. So it's as if on some level in the military or in the intelligence, a decision was made to allow the attack to be horrible enough as to justify a counter. Now, I'm going to give this a different, deeper perspective. Now, it doesn't mean it's necessarily the cabal. There are multiple interests which align. So, there's another interest which, think of it from a intelligence point of view. Let's say you are the head of intelligence in Israel. You have handed over the whole of the Gaza region and now it's freed. You have no say. You can do nothing practically. And you're watching over 17 years all these attacks and missiles and weapons being built up. You know it's going to happen one day. If you do nothing, it'll just keep on growing. So there has to be a point where you say, all right, we have to say enough is enough and end it before it gets much worse. But if you suddenly unilaterally invade and say, look, we just found all these weapons, we need to destroy them, you'll have nobody's backing. But if you keep quiet, you know there's an attack, you allow the attack to take place and let the world see that, look, this is the extent of the atrocity and the values, the perversion of values by which we are being attacked, for which then now our next action of destroying those weapons bases is justified. Then it would make sense. Now, this is not something new. This has happened many times in US history, in European history, across many countries. And even during the Second World War, many things were justified by allowing an attack first and then retaliating hard, because that's the only way you would get public support. So, a group might choose to make this option, but it would align with other interests of the cabal which wanted to, let's say, which were threatening Netanyahu. And there's another angle which is even more layered, which was, you will find in one of the videos, I did not find it here, but it's been in circulation, where recently they discovered large gas deposits off the coast, just across Gaza. So if you are to make use of those gas deposits, well, obviously you have to have access to that region. So many interests come in, and these are petroleum interests. Now, petroleum interests, you must understand, are multinational. They don't care for you, they don't care for your people or your nationality or your boundaries. They want what they want through the agents in your country who are willing to serve their interests, for which they will do anything, including eliminate people. And this has happened, as you know, everywhere in the world. Wherever pipeline interests were involved, wars have taken place, even in the Middle East and even in Europe. And wars have always involved pipelines, as you know, even in the Ukraine war, they blew up Russia's gas pipelines to Germany, etc. So there's a very deep connection between the oil interests and wars, the banking interests and wars. So I've put up two more links regarding this. The first link is called, I've just put the description, all wars are bankers' wars. It shows you how the banking framework is behind and benefits from all wars, irrespective of who wins, and they don't care who wins. The other link which I've also put is a link where one of these US think tanks speaks of how they want to go to war with Iran. And they actually say that it will be useful if somebody else does a false flag attack. In this case, we won't be blamed, but we want to do that. And so there's also an article in Business Insider which says that the headline is something like, top researcher suggests Israel gets nastier with Iran and sink a submarine to create a false flag attack on Iran to justify US invasion. That's the broad line of it. I've put all these links, and one link of Julian Assange, who is the founder of WikiLeaks, who speaks of all these wars really being endless. They're not about a cause, they're an end in itself for financial use and so on. But this link with Patrick Byrne, who describes the causes of Israel's intelligence failure, is what I'm referring to in this part of the discussion. So all these interests align. All of them want war. And then it's just a question of when. If not October, September, if not September, November. But one of the reasons why it has happened now in October links to Ukraine. 2 months before, the funding for Ukraine has been blocked in the United States, and for reasons given that the Speaker of the House, of the Republican Speaker, was removed, who was part of the cabal interests and was doing the endless funding, replaced by somebody who said, for any funds going to Ukraine, we need accountability. Show us where the funds are going, what it is used for. So far, the billions which have gone have never been accounted for. So the demand for accountability ensured that no more funds were going to Ukraine. And they demanded the separation of Ukraine funds from Israeli funds, where earlier everything was put in one chunk and no one knew where it was going. So the result was that there was a compulsion now for the funding to flow through different routes, need for a different war. And so this is one of the compulsions for the timing now. And a final compulsion which I will speak of is what I've been alluding to since the beginning of this part of our discussion on current affairs, the next 1 year. So many countries are going to elections. What happens in the next 1 year will decide what happens the next 10 years and the direction in which the global organization moves, whether towards a one world government or towards a committee of independent countries. That decision will take place by what happens in the next 1 year, which will decide what happens in the next 10 years, which will decide a very long term. So there are compulsions currently which want war, which want to create excuses by which humanity can be put in chaos and the clarity of individual freedom removed under some pretext or other, war being the easiest. So all of these things collide. I'm giving you not a simple answer, it's a multifaceted group of forces, but all of them align at this point for a reason. The result was that the attack took place, the massacre took place. Basically 4,000 people severely injured, 1,500 officially butchered, more than 150 hostages taken, children, women and so on, many were in the most horrible ways. But I'm going to now ask you to look at it from the other side, from the Hamas side. The people who have trained for the attack, you have to see from their thinking. It's obvious eventually Israel will retaliate. It's obvious that even if they send in 1,000 fighters or 2,000 or 5,000, eventually most of them will die in Israel. So if you see their plans was to go all across Israel, all the way to the eastern side. They crossed almost halfway through. But eventually, wherever they are, they would have been scattered, they would have been killed, eventually. So everybody knew that the attack was a suicide attack. You must understand this, the mentality. So everyone knew they would die. If not in the initial entry, on the return with hostages, the Israeli military would come in. They know that because there's a track record. It's not as if Israel has been pacifist against attacks. It has always retaliated with force. So they knew they would come in. They had prepared already for the publicity material to have global pressure on Israel. All that was in place, and that's how we see the orchestrated way. But they know also that the military will come all the way in eventually. And you have to understand the mindset there. The mindset actually says it does not matter if we die. Just this is an end in itself. It does not matter if there is this enormous suffering of our people, the Gaza residents, Palestinians in Gaza. It does not matter that there will be this large civilian casualty for this end. They knew all this would happen. Everything that you're saying, the suffering, they knew it would all happen. And yet they did what they did to provoke Israel for this response. Because Israel is not going to say, all right, we will let you attack us again. And they have said this publicly. If we stop now, they have all the means to attack, repeat the same thing. We have to go all the way, finish all the weapons and eliminate the top leadership. They won't stop. That's very clear. And the other side, the Hamas and its controllers know that. By the way, the controllers of Hamas don't live in Gaza. They live in other countries, in some of them in Qatar and some of them in Iran and Lebanon and so on, in great comfort in villas. So they are not going to die. It's their soldiers who are going to die. But the ones doing this operation know exactly what's going to happen. And they've chosen to allow for the suffering of their own people. And this is the part which is extremely difficult to understand, and it only, that's why I said it's an ideology. Given these two ideologies, I am placing this now in a larger context of human evolution. You see, one of the ways by which you can know which value is better than another is you exaggerate it to a global scale. If you take the Israeli value system, whatever it may be, whatever its limitations you may point out, scale it to the globe. What kind of a world will it be? When everybody is by the same values. Take the other side, the Hamas mentality, scale it to the globe. What will the world be like? Which is relatively superior in evolutionary terms. I'm not saying the other side is perfect. Which is relatively better, which leaves a way open for something higher or truer. Some freedom of thought, some freedom of higher values, some questioning and introspection and growth. And you can see very clearly. And so from an evolutionary point of view, from the circumstances which had been piling up and the anger and hatred and the funding and the ideological base, this collision was inevitable in one form or other. Out of it, what has to emerge ideally should be something which allows everyone to grow. The hope will be that it's only the Hamas leadership. Once eliminated on the ground level, the people will say that's not what we want. Or even if they thought they wanted this, having seen the consequences, they will say, but that's not what we want. And they will choose something better. And if they do that, as was already the case before Hamas came in, when the PLO had already made peace with Israel, perhaps a different relationship can form. If they do not do that, then in the nature of the evolutionary churning, as you know, eventually even entire cultural groups, civilizational groups have just been swallowed up in time with nothing remaining. But it will be a pity if the things of higher values are lost, and those should be protected. For us who are looking at it from far, you must understand it's not an isolated case there. As I said, it's an ideology. That ideology is in your country, in your space. What is shocking, and this situation has exposed it, in the Ivy League schools in the United States, in Harvard and MIT, you had the heads of Harvard and MIT saying, when they were asked in the hearings in the Congress, US Congress, they did not decry the slogans for the massacre of Jews. On their campus, there were young students chanting for massacre of Israel. And they kept quiet. So when they were asked why did they keep quiet, they said, well, until it turns into action, we will do nothing. In other words, you're going to allow this ideology to breed, and the day the spark comes when the massacre starts in the United States, then you will step in. That's the mentality being offered, at least. And it's not just there, it happened in India. It's happening in every single country, because the organization, as I said, had entrenched itself to activate this mentality. This, I will call it a mental virus. Now, it's not a phrase I'm making it up, it's the phrase that Elon Musk used when he explained why he took over Twitter. He said, looking around in what was one of the most beautiful spaces in the United States, in San Francisco, how within 10 years it was reduced to this ugly, dirty, horrible condition, and people being drug addicts on the streets. And he said, it's just that this mental virus, he said, was spreading. He could see it was now spreading by the same group all over the world, and there had to be a way to stop it. And that was his primary reason for taking up Twitter and opening it up to free speech. That's the thing we have to recognize. These things do not start with an action, they start with an ideology. And as I pointed out, the ideology can infiltrate any system of belief, any religion, any culture, if you are not vigilant. And the reason for this discussion is to bring all of us into awareness of what's happening, so that we can ensure it does not happen in our space. Because if you don't, it will come in, and when it comes in, it will be too late. And I'm saying this so openly because this has happened in the ashram and in Oroville. And it happened about now nearly 15 years ago. As many of you know, that a book was brought out on the authority of the ashram's name, abusing Sri Aurobindo, declaring him a madman and a sexually frustrate, and all kinds of accusations, dismissing his writings on grounds that the chapter length differed. It is so stupid. But the nature of the attack was so perverse. Every single fact of Sri Aurobindo's life was twisted and put in what today is called the woke mentality. And when this book was protected by the institutional powers, it created the division in the community. Those who were for Sri Aurobindo and those who were for the administrative power and the benefits they got from it. This split took place in the Sri Aurobindo ashram. The same mentality you see in Auroville, a division between those who want the mother's vision of Auroville to move forward and those who do not want it and want it to remain a hippie commune. And if it can happen here, it can happen everywhere in your homes. And this is the reason why it's so important for us to understand this from an evolutionary psycho-spiritual perspective. And that's why I've taken a little time to go into this. I've also put some of the links up here. We have also to consciously disengage from the propaganda and the hypnotic influence of the propaganda. You see, all those who have gone around making these slogans for the Palestinian people, why is it they have not made slogans for the Pakistanis massacring the Balochis, where the massacre is larger in number and sustained over years? Why are they not making the same flags and demonstrations for the Uyghur Muslims that China has been in the millions, jailing, neutering biologically, and indoctrinating in some of the worst horrible ways? No squeak by the Muslim countries. And you have to ask yourself why. Pakistan, which speaks for Muslims under oppression, let's say in Palestine or in supposedly in India, not one squeak on millions in China. And when you look at this big picture, you have to say, oh, there's something wrong here. You are being lied to. The media is deliberately swaying you to an issue which, in relative terms, compared to the millions of Uyghur Muslims in China, is a very small issue. Read up about it. You don't even know, because the mainstream media will not tell you anything about the Uyghur Muslims and their suffering, or the massacre that's taking place in Armenia, and so on. So the moment you look at this big picture and you become aware, you realize there's a game being played and you are being played. So become conscious of this. Recognize the underlying evolutionary values and compulsions, and based on that you take your stance, of which the most practical thing is protect your space, protect your family, protect your children, protect your country from these false values, these ideological perversions, and what Elon Musk has called the mind virus. Because this is the biggest threat. And this is what Sri Aurobindo warned us about going back 100 years in as explicit a detail as this, when he spoke of the subjective age and its dangers, and what was necessary for us to be able to cut through that appearance and align with the soul values. And so this is where I will pause with the situation in Israel. And I've tried to keep in mind the big picture of the sweep of the civilizational values that emerged from the Hebrew culture, and then the stages of its evolution and whatever struggles it may have gone through, but the circumstances and its importance for Europe and the world. And then this collision that takes place of ideological levels. Keep this big picture in mind always. Don't get caught up by strong emotional images. I want to close, and this was a request from one of our viewers, Nikhil Kumar. He wanted something to be spoken for 9th of December, because this is the day when Sri Aurobindo's body was placed in the Samadhi. And so I want to close with this, because when Sri Aurobindo wrote all that he did, it was not only to awaken us but to give us the clarity of the vision and the means for this change of consciousness and the evolutionary leap that is necessary if humanity has to survive. Not only he gave you this, he worked for it in himself and in humanity, Sri Aurobindo and the mother as one consciousness, ensured the full turn of the energy and the force and direction of human evolution from what would have been otherwise probably self-destruction to a higher spiritual destiny. And the part of humanity that refuses, of course, has a freedom to refuse and subside. But all this he did, the result of which is that eventually the spiritual awakening of humanity is certain. The question is only of the passage, and that depends on us and our participation. So the mother made this observation on 8th of December 1950. She said, "The lack of receptivity of the earth and men is mostly responsible for the decision Sri Aurobindo has taken regarding his body. But one thing is certain, what has happened on the physical plane affects in no way the truth of his teaching. All that he has said is perfectly true and remains so. Time and the course of events will prove it abundantly." And then on the 9th, when she wrote this as a prayer to Sri Aurobindo and to the body of Sri Aurobindo in particular, because that's the frame, the vehicle through which his work in the physical world was done. And it's a prayer which all of us can recall, repeat, and align ourselves with. And we will close with this today. And 9th of December 1950. To thee who hast been the material envelope of our master, the physical body. To thee our infinite gratitude. Before thee who hast done so much for us, who has worked, struggled, suffered, hoped, endured so much. Before thee who hast willed all, attempted all, prepared, achieved all for us. Before thee we bow down and implore that we may never forget, even for a moment, all we owe to thee. The full sense of this, all we owe to thee, we will understand only a few centuries down, when it will be obvious how the whole human evolution made a radical change in direction during the time of Sri Aurobindo's action on earth. And that's why she says, who has willed all, attempted all, prepared, achieved all for us. It's been done. And that achievement has been imprinted in humanity. The rest is only a question of unfolding. And so, to one who has done this, before thee we bow down and implore that we may never forget, even for a moment, all we owe to thee. And at least on this day, we can hold this in gratitude and all concentrate together in gratitude to Sri Aurobindo and the Mother.